So hello, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. Today, we're going to be talking about sustainable energy options in agriculture. Recent figures from the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland show that although the country has committed to reducing its CO2 emissions by 4.8% per annum from 2021 to 2025, the related emissions instead were up by 5.4% in 2021. So there's plenty of opportunity for sectors such as the agricultural sector to respond to this demand for renewable energy. And we're delighted to be joined by our resident expert in renewables, Barry Caslin, who's Energy and Rural Development Specialist with Teagasc. Good morning, Barry. You're very welcome.
Good morning, Mark. Good to be here. How are you?
Very good. Thanks, Barry. And also good morning to Kevin O'Sullivan, who's ASSAP Advisor based in the Killarney office. Good morning, Kevin. You're going to help us with questions later on.
Morning, Mark. Yeah.
Great. So, Barry, you're joining us from Brussels this morning. You're attending a meeting in relation to all of this renewable energies sector and the opportunities that are there for agriculture. Could you tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing in this space?
Yeah, I suppose I'm here from Brussels this morning. We have a final meeting of the consortium of a European project called Agro-Fossil Free. So that has been a 3-year project. It's finishing in September of this year. So that I'd be involved in a couple of European projects like that will be funded through the likes of Horizon 2020. I'd also be involved in, I suppose, developing support material for advisors on the whole area of renewable energy. A lot of interest, for example, at the moment in solar PV and solar in general. So whether it's large scale or small scale micro generation of solar energy on farms. And of course, there's a big interest in the area of biomethane, that's biogas or anaerobic digestion. Hasn't really kicked off in Ireland to any significant extent yet because we don't have any support mechanisms in place for AD or biogas. But I think watch this space, we will see something else happening there. So yeah, I suppose it's really communicating and getting that message out there as regards what are the opportunities for renewable deployment on farms and maybe the opportunities for farmers to start in the future selling electricity back to the grid. And not just a small scale, but we will see larger scale options emerging even towards the end of this year for selling electricity back to the grid. And of course, there's a large interest in the area of biomass. That'll be, pulpwood from forestry, maybe the likes of energy crops, maybe utilizing the likes of straw for combustion for energy systems as well. So it's looking at all that biomass that could be used for maybe heat generation and to meet our future targets that we have.
Very good. Thanks, Barry. And look, there's obviously the government are putting a lot of resources into this as well. We can see through the various schemes. So I'm sure you're going to touch on that during your presentation. So if I could ask you to share your slides with us, Barry, and just while you're doing that, we just remind everybody that you please do send us your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And also today's session will be recorded and available on the Teagasc YouTube channel, as well as the presentation will be available on the Teagasc website. And of course, if you want to access the webinar as a podcast, you can just look up Signpost webinar and or Signpost series, and it'll bring you to the Signpost webinar on the platform, whichever platform that you use for your podcast. So Barry, we'll hand over to you and we'll take some questions afterwards, and we will talk to you in a little while.
Thanks, Mark. You can see my screen okay there now, yeah?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, lovely. Okay, good morning, everyone, and great to be here. And so I'm just really going to kind of touch on the various areas where energy is used within agriculture and maybe look at opportunities that are there at the moment for renewable deployment, maybe energy efficiency options on the farm as well. So just start off by looking at maybe the likes of the industry such as dairying, and there's different different benchmarks for energy use within the dairy sector. And it can be anywhere from 1,550 kilowatt hours per cow down to 1,210 kilowatt hours per cow in best practice examples. You can see there the majority of that energy on dairy farms will be field operations, tractors, that'll be marked gas oil, so green diesel. And then of course the energy that kicks in there for milk cooling will be the largest on, as part of the dairy aspect of it. The milking aspect of it would be the milk cooling, 133 kilowatt hours per cow per year, down to, in best practice examples, down to 65 kilowatt hours per cow. So that's where the electricity is being used. And then vacuum pump and water heating. Pig units, again, there's various areas, whether it's farrowing units, weaning houses, finishing units, And the figures are quite diverse there as well, from 36 kilowatt hours per pig produced down to 16 kilowatt hours per pig produced. And again, there's benchmarks or standards for the poultry industry, and these are, I suppose, areas that some people probably are doing better on than others. And it's, it's maybe by doing a farm audit that you'll actually discover where you're using most of this energy on your farm and where you can actually reduce the consumption of energy in those various areas, whether that's for lighting, maybe by putting in LED lighting as opposed to fluorescent tubes. That's more efficient ventilation systems and humidity controls might reduce your energy consumption there. You can see there the difference between typical and best practice examples there, and there's quite a variance. I just wanted to make people aware that it is possible to get a voucher from SEI for a non-farm energy audit. And these audits, they identify that the energy usage for the different types of equipment on the farm, you do have to have an annual spend of over €10,000 on energy to qualify for this audit. But this €2,000 voucher would go most of the way, if not all the way, of covering the cost of an audit on your farm. So that's available from SEI. And it covers stuff like milk cooling, hot water pipes, monitoring systems, humidity controls, pumps, lighting, heat recovery. So identifying where the energy is being used and where you can become more efficient. And I always say as well that the number one fuel in every farm should be energy efficiency, because there's no point in pumping heat into a poultry unit or a pig unit where you're losing that heat out through leaky doors, walls that could be better insulated. So the first fuel is always get your efficiency right. And that would be the same in our own domestic dwelling houses as well. There's no point in pumping heat, whether that's renewable heat or fossil fuel heat. There's no point in pumping that into a house that's leaky. First of all, we have to seal those doors, seal those windows, and improve the efficiency of those houses and minimize the kilowatt hours of heat that's been generated either from renewables or from fossil fuels. In terms of, I suppose, microgeneration and solar PV, and this terminology, microgeneration, and some of you may have heard about it in recent times, it's systems that are generating electricity that are less than 50 kilowatt in output. So 2023 was a significant year for solar PV. We had the elimination of planning requirements in October of 2022. We've had a new simplified grid connection policy. That's the NC6, the NC7 application forms. We have the revision to the VAT regulations, where VAT has been removed from solar PV projects. There's a 6% grant towards TAMS, that's on the farm and the farmhouse. And we'll be covering this after a while. And the paybacks here are anywhere between 2 and 4 years for TAMS related solar PV projects. So we have the options now for selling the electricity back to the grid as well, which has been a game changer for all of this. So I think a lot of the barriers have been removed towards microgeneration and solar PV, and that's why there's a significant interest in this whole area. I also wanted to bring your attention to this area, small scale generation. So it's our small scale generation electricity scheme that will be operational, I think, by the end of this year. So I suppose just watch this space. Really, is the government is in the process of developing this type of support mechanism, because most people will be familiar with the microgeneration, may have heard about it at this stage. That's small scale, less than 50 kilowatt. But there has been nothing, and there's also the RES scheme, which is the larger projects that are over 500 kilowatts. Where we see hundreds of acres covered in the likes of solar PV panels or wind turbines. Those larger projects are covered by RES, Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, RESS. But up to now, there's been nothing in between. So between the 50 kilowatt and the 500 kilowatt range. So there will be a scheme being introduced later this year. It's been promised for this year. I think we'll be hearing something about it fairly soon, is the small scale generation. And these are the systems between 50 kilowatts and 6 megawatts. So there'll be I think there'll be opportunities here even for farms and businesses to start exporting electricity with projects maybe up to 1 megawatt. We will see community projects going up to maybe 6 megawatts. So the terms and conditions haven't been released of this yet, but this is what has been outlined in the consultation. So the details are going to be released fairly soon. So initiative has the potential to unlock opportunities for farmers to establish commercially viable medium to large scale renewable energy projects on their farms. It's going to run for 8 years up to 2030, allowing projects to secure funding during that time. The biggest challenge is the ability of farmers to secure an appropriate grid connection for the export of electricity. And the scheme is likely to be funded from the PSO levy. That's the Public Service Obligation Levy. So that's the way it's done in most European countries, whereby you pay a levy on your bills, and that covers the higher cost of producing this electricity from renewables. The government believes that the scheme could deliver 800 megawatts of renewable electricity, equivalent to 4,000 acres of solar panels by 2030. The main types of technologies that will be in it will be solar PV, hybrid wind and solar projects, hybrid wind and storage projects, biogas fueled high efficiency combined heat and power, biomass fueled high efficiency combined heat and power. So there'll be a variety of technologies unveiled that can be availed of. And again, this is going to be an opportunity for farmers to, use their land for these projects. Microgeneration type projects of less than 50 kilowatts are more relevant to, your own self-consumption on the farm. It's not really a diversification opportunity. It's not an opportunity for making money out of the process. Of selling the electricity, even though you can sell in a microgeneration scenario. This small scale generation will be more of a diversification opportunity. It will allow you to export electricity and set up projects where they're commercially viable on your farm and start selling renewable electricity. So it's a space to watch, really. So the current wholesale price of electricity is high, and the support mechanisms, I suppose, will be more than likely what's called a floating feed-in premium. And these floating feed-in premiums, they work in a similar way to conventional tariffs. So farmers will receive a premium on top of the market price of their electricity. That's the way it's expected to work. So if the price of electricity goes below a certain level, the market price of electricity about 2 years ago was around 5 cents per kilowatt hour. At the moment, it's around 14 to 21 cents per kilowatt hour. So if it goes below a certain level, and that's where this feed-in premium would come to top that up to ensure a guaranteed payback on the investment. So I suppose it gives a bit of confidence to people who are investing in these type of projects, whether it's a community-led project or whether it's on your own farm, and you're investing in the project yourself. It gives you that surety that you'll get the payback on your investment. So it's okay. And then moving on to the larger schemes, that's the one that has to come and will be announced in the next few weeks. Certainly it'll be announced by the end of the year, and that we'll know where we stand in terms of support mechanisms that will be in place, whether it's a capital grant towards projects or whether it's a floating feed-in premium. But this one here, the RES, the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, we do know about. So that's expected to deliver between 2,500 gigawatt hours and 3,500 gigawatt hours in renewable electricity across 26 and 2027. So RES, it's a competitive auction-based system where developers of renewable energy projects, both wind and solar, they compete with each other for government support. So there's the RES 3 auction. We've already had 2 auctions under RES. So we had RES 1 and RES 2, and RES 3 is due in September of this year. And I suppose this is the support mechanism that's really leading to the deployment of a lot of solar PV right across the country. So there is an expectation that we will see in the region of between maybe 30 to 40,000 acres of land covered in solar PV with solar PV panels by 2030 to meet this target that we have there. There's a target of 8 gigawatt hours from solar PV by 2030. So and that's part of the climate action plan. So this is on a series of auctions, and up to now communities have been involved in this, and it's not really for the faint-hearted for communities to be involved in these auction-based systems, because they are quite complicated, and it's looking as if communities will be moved out of this process and into the small-scale generation process, and that's where projects up to 6 megawatts will be funded through the small-scale generation scheme. So that'll be, I suppose, easier for communities to get involved, or theoretically it should be easier for communities to get involved by moving them out of RES and moving them into small-scale generation as a funding mechanism. Okay, there's also funding there for communities. So despite the removal of community category from RES 3, there's an obligatory community benefit fund that remains in place. So any of those big RES projects, they have to set aside a certain amount of money within their projects for a community benefit fund. So that provides money for communities in close proximity to RES funded projects for the duration of the support scheme. And the support scheme is always there for 15 years from the time that it's given the approval. There's also community projects there under SEI, Sustainable Energy Communities Programme. So that's something that I know that you highlighted on Signpost in the past. There's a great example of an SEC. In Ireland at the moment, there's probably around over 600 different sustainable energy communities that are listed with SEI at the moment. There's a couple of those are farm ones, but there's a great example in Dingle, and I know you highlighted this one in the past, where they developed a master plan in that region, looked at what type of efficiencies are being achieved in the various and on a number of farms where they carried out audits on those farms, and they found where the main energy was being used and where savings could be made. And they've also, they're working together as a community as well in terms of buying solar panels and better buying power in terms of working as a group as opposed to working as individuals. At the moment, we have no support for the area of anaerobic digestion or biogas in Ireland. So there is an expectation that we will see a renewable heat obligation or an RHO that'll be put in place to incentivize the use of renewable fuel. That's set to begin in 2024. A technical consultation was due to be undertaken in March of this year. It hasn't really happened yet. We have a support scheme for renewable heat that was launched in July of 2019. And this was, that's for biomass type boilers for pig units or poultry units, or hotels or hospitals. Any large buildings can put in biomass boilers. Initially, the emissions trading scheme sector was omitted from this. They weren't allowed to apply. But now in recent months, it was relaunched and it's now open to farmers and as well as the ETS sector. So there's a wide group that can avail of the SSRH or the support scheme for renewable heat, which I'm going to go into a bit more detail on in a few minutes. So the support scheme for renewable heat, it offers ongoing tariffs for 15 years for using heat from biomass or biogas, as well as a 40% grant for air, water or ground source heat pumps. And TAMS 3 also provides grant aid for biomass boilers and heat pumps. And just for your listeners, to give you an idea about the whole biogas process and what's involved in it, the opportunities are here for farmers to maybe supply manure, maybe slurry for larger projects. I'm not too sure what way the whole process is going to work, but I think it'll be larger type projects than has evolved across Europe. I think these will be larger type AD digesters or biogas units that'll be using manure and slurry and also grass silage to feed these digesters. So it goes into the primary digester, and from the primary digester, sometimes you have a secondary digester, and from that you're generating heat, you're generating electricity. That's combined heat and power, and that's typically what has been done right across Europe, where you have your heat and your electricity being generated on site. But I think we'll be going down the route of upgrading that biogas, that raw biogas, which is about maybe 60% methane, which is about 35% carbon dioxide, and then 5% trace gases like water vapor and hydrogen sulfide. So we will be looking at maybe upgrading that biogas, taking out those trace gases, taking out the carbon dioxide, and you're left with over 97% methane. And that's for what's your compressed biomethane. And of course, that compressed biomethane can be fed into the national gas grid. So there's no retrofitting of houses, putting in new boilers or anything like that. You're literally using the existing, you're feeding gas into the existing businesses that are already using it. And that's upgraded biogas. And I suppose agriculture will have a major role to play in this business and for this to evolve, because farmers are the landowners and they have to decide and be convinced that they're happy that this makes financial sense for them to grow grass, to feed maybe a digester. They mightn't necessarily be owners of these digesters, or maybe they could potentially invest in these digesters themselves in the future, but there will be an opportunity, I think, of supplying grass or manure or slurry into these digesters as an income generating opportunity. And I suppose Gas Networks Ireland are really pushing this whole area at the moment, and because there's a realization that we can't continue to use fossil fuel gas or natural gas to heat our homes and our buildings, and we have to move towards renewable gas. And renewable gas, this is the only way we can actually really produce it, is from farmers providing grass for digesters and maybe slurry. And there'll be a lot of gathering on a lot of this material as well. So there'll be different types of structures needed to mobilize all these feedstocks in the future as well. Because the government has set a very large target in the latest climate action plan for biomethane, and that's why I'm kind of referring more to biomethane than CHP or combined heat and power, because I think we will be upgrading this biogas to biomethane. The government target is 5.7 terawatt hours of biomethane gas by 2030. So that's quite a significant ask. It'll mean the construction of anywhere between 200 and 250 biogas plants. There'll be various sizes, from 20 gigawatt hour plants maybe to 40 gigawatt hour plants. That's the way they're measured. So the only policy instrument to support the industry is the RHO. That's the Renewable Heat Obligation. That's the one I referred to there a while ago. So up to now, we haven't really had a support mechanism. Most other countries across Europe have deployed support mechanisms. You know, Germany has been doing it for the last 20 years. Northern Ireland has over 80 plants built at this stage. You know, it was all down to support mechanisms in those areas. We don't have any significant anaerobic digestion industry in Ireland, because we didn't really have the supports up to now. But I think it'll be part of the jigsaw puzzle of technologies that's going to be needed to meet our renewable targets in the future. So there won't be any one renewable technology that's going to win out. They'll all have a role to play in the future. So the only industry experts believe that it falls short of providing the necessary confidence and certainty needed by investors, this RHO. So there remains to be seen what, you know, how investors are going to get involved once the RHO and the details of it are announced. To construct the required number of plants, I know that the estimates are there that it's going to require an investment around 2.5 billion. And we do have a target of an interim target of by 2025 of 1 terawatt hour. Unfortunately, I think that the lead-in time for these digesters is quite long. You know, by the time you get planning and grid connections and gas purchase agreements, all of this in place, there is a lead-in time, and we still don't have a support mechanism in place to drive this industry forward. So unfortunately, I think this interim target of 1 terawatt hour by 2025 could be difficult to achieve at this stage. And obviously, if we're slow at meeting our interim target, our target of 5.7 terawatt hours will be equally hard to achieve as well. So there is a kind of a burning platform here. So the government is also launching a biomethane strategy, and that's due to be released in the third quarter of this year. So there's various government departments and involved in that process. The biomass industry, it continues to be a significant contributor to renewable energy sector. Now, don't forget, grass is a form of biomass as well. But I'm talking about biomass here in the likes of the wood industry, the pulpwood from forestry. It'll have a major role to play in our transition to clean energy sources as well as energy crops. The support scheme for renewable heat. I mentioned this earlier on as being a support mechanism that's there since June of 2019. This really, I suppose, when it was introduced, we entered into the COVID era, and fossil fuel prices, as you might all remember, dropped significantly. So there wasn't really that much interest in hotels or hospitals investing in the SSRH or renewable technologies. The other issues about filling room space in hotels, etc., at that time. But now, I suppose, when fossil fuel prices have increased, there's a realization here that they can insulate themselves by availing of this scheme. So as you can see here, there's different tiers, tier 1 to 6. So the more you burn, the less you get paid. And I suppose it's a bit different to the scheme that was introduced in Northern Ireland, where the more you burn, the more you got paid. So here, as you burn more, you get less payment per kilowatt hour or per megawatt hour. As you can see here, the first 300 megawatt hours are paid at €56.60 per megawatt hour, and converting kilowatt hours to megawatt hours. And you can see here between 300 and 1,000, or the next 700 megawatt hours are paid at €30.20 per megawatt hour. So there's the more you burn. I think it's a well-designed scheme, and there is a pretty good uptake, certainly in the poultry sector and the pig sector, who are putting in these boilers. There have been some hiccups along the way, but I think generally the scheme is working well now at this stage. And that's just an example of, a payback. If you had a poultry unit, put in a 400 kilowatt boiler, these are only assumptions, by the way. If the cost of the boiler was 260,000 and it was running for 1,700 megawatt hours per year, or 1.7 million kilowatt hours, so the oil it's displacing is 160,500 litres. If you put a value on that oil at 66 cents per litre, that's the cost of that oil would be almost 106,000 euro. The wood chip is costing per annum, if we assume it's costing 58,000, that's a saving of 47,930 already by moving from oil to wood chip. So then if you add the SSRH extra income, that's the first 300 megawatt hours here, because it's 1,700 megawatt hours. The first 300 megawatt hours at €56.60. Note these payments are available for 15 years. So 16,980, and then you get tier 2 at 21,140, and you get tier 3 at €5 per megawatt hour, which is again 700 megawatt hours. So you add that together with this saving here, you're getting a total saving of 89,550. So it gives a payback in just under 3 years. So again, this is really just for calculation purposes, and that you can see how the SSRH works. As the price of fossil fuels increase, you get a shorter payback. But as the price of fossil fuels come down, you get but I suppose the expectation is that we will see this price going up and up with carbon taxes, etc., and to move to decarbonisation. I generally put up this slide as well to give people an idea about, what are the CO2 emissions savings within, if by putting in PV panels or by putting in biomass boiler. So grid electricity, if you go onto the SEAI website, the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland website, and you just Google their SEAI emission factors, you'll see all these emission factors for grid electricity, coal combustion, kerosene, and they're kilograms per kilowatt hour is generally the way that they're measured. So grid electricity would be 0.346 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And that figure has been coming down over the last number of years. I remember about maybe 10 years ago, that figure was over 0.6 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour. But because we have so much more wind, we have over 40% of our electricity is coming from wind now at the moment. That figure has come down to 0.346, and will come down more because we have a target of 80% of our electricity coming from wind, from renewables by 2030. So that will come down more as we charge our cars and heat our houses using grid electricity. That'll mean that operation will have a lower carbon footprint as a result. So just to give you an idea, if a 5 kilowatt PV system generating 4,200 kilowatt hours or units of electricity per year, that would avoid 1.45 tons of CO2 per year. So, or if you're using kerosene oil, and if you say your tank at your house, if you're using 1,000 liters of kerosene, that each liter of kerosene is about 10.5 kilowatt hours per liter. So there'll be 10,500 kilowatt hours in 1,000 liters of oil, and you multiply that 10,500 by the emission factor here of 0.257. That would mean by combusting that in your tank in your house, you're emitting or releasing almost 2.7 tons of CO2 per year. So that's just kind of putting it in context that if you're making a saving in terms of emission reduction, on your farm, but how the deployment of renewable technologies such as solar PV or a biomass boiler can do that. Just note as well that you are releasing CO2 in the process as you combust biomass, but because it's originated from plant matter as opposed to being a fossil fuel that's been in the ground for millions of years, that's why it's deemed to be a carbon neutral fuel. So it's from accounting perspective. I also want to make you aware of the solar capital investment scheme. So every eligible farmer can avail of the 60% grant of solar PV systems. So that includes inverters, controllers, cabling, the isolation switches that's associated with solar PV. It falls under what's called a standalone investment ceiling of €90,000. So it doesn't affect, alternative measures under TAM. So in the past, for example, the solar grant used to be 40%, but if you got a solar grant, it would affect you getting maybe grants for statted tanks or other buildings on your farm. But this now, the solar capital investment scheme, is a separate silo of money. So if you invest in this and you get your 60% grant, it doesn't affect you drawing down money for doing tanks over the rural development program period, which will be for another 5 years or so. Solar panels costs vary depending on the type, the quality, and the size of the system. If your solar quota is over the reference costs, you have to pay the difference, which is not eligible for grant aid. So there's reference costs that are there by the department, and you have to, if you go above those, you don't get paid the difference. If you go below those, you get paid for whatever the cost of those panels has been. So the first tranche hasn't closed yet. It was to close on the 16th of June. So these solar PV investment, the solar capital investment scheme, will be done in various tranches. The first tranche was due to be the 16th of June, but it's now been extended out to the 30th. Excuse me, the 30th of June. So we will see various tranches of this, and there'll be lead-in times in order to get projects approved. And you do need to get your approval from the Department of Agriculture before you commence any work. And these are the reference costs. So the department have put in these indicative costs of €1,441 per kilowatt installed. So if you put in a 20 kilowatt, if you put in a 10 kilowatt system, it's 10 by 1,441, and you add on this installation figure of 1,849. So if you take a 10 kilowatt peak in output, that would work out as 10 by 1,441 plus this 1,849, and you get 60% of this figure. So the maximum amount that you could get in terms of grant is 9,917 towards this project. So it's quite a good and generous grant, and I suppose it is going to help us in meeting our targets of the 8 gigawatts of solar PV on roofs, and also and also in larger projects by 2030. So I think this kind of initiative is really necessary, and creating this burning platform that people realize that this is a good offer and it is something that should be availed of. Solar PV rechargeable batteries are also eligible for grant aid, and that's up to 50% of the panel peak output. So what I mean there by the panel peak output is if you're getting a 10 kilowatt system like here, you can only get a maximum of 50% of that, i.e. that's 5 kilowatt hours of battery storage. Some people might feel that's not enough, and in some cases I think people will be putting on maybe larger battery storage, but they will only get TAMS grant aid of up to 5 kilowatt hours of battery storage. So the reference cost in this works out at it's 703 per kilowatt hour, so it'd be 5 by 703, it's 4268. And you also add the 753 of an installation cost. So the 6% grant would give you €2,560.80 in this situation for a 5 kilowatt hour battery, and the difference then you pay yourself. So all electricity generated from grant aided panels must be used solely for agricultural purposes, and this includes powering the farmhouse. So a lot of people aren't aware of that you can actually get your farmhouse and your farm included at the 60% grant aid. It's not permitted to use the electricity for non-farming or commercial purposes. So I think we have to be careful on this, that if there's other businesses on the farm on the same MPRN, that this has to be declared, and that we should be making deductions for that amount of energy that's being used, maybe for an ancillary business that's maybe on the same MPRN. That's the meter points reference number. So it's only for farming purposes and the farmhouse. The regulations aim to prevent farmers having an unfair advantage over other unsupported industries, because farming is actually the only industry at the moment that can avail of any kind of capital grants. This may change in the future, that we may see capital grants for other sectors as well, but at this point in time, agriculture is the only area that's actually getting grants, maybe much to the envy of other industries. So I think we have to do everything right here and make sure that there's no other commercial activities happening on the farm, only for farming purposes. But the regulations, the department can't stop you from exporting electricity. In many situations, like on a dairy farm where cows are out grazing on a hot summer's day in June, July, and August, and you're milking in the mornings, you're milking in the evenings, you have that peak in demand for electricity in the mornings, peak in the evenings, you do have that, you will be generating electricity throughout the day. You'll only be able to use a certain amount of a base load of that for cooling milk. You can put a certain amount of that electricity to charging batteries. You can do a certain amount of it to as a diverter to your hot water, to heat your hot water, to do a hot wash in the evening, for example. But you will have to be exporting a certain amount of electricity. So that's where farmers will be sending in an NC7 application into ESB networks and looking for a grid connection. This is going to be the main limiting factor, by the way. You will find that your transformer capacity will be the main limiting factor and will limit how much electricity you can export back to the grid. There are going to be, to claim the grant, the size of the solar PV system will be determined based on the farm's electricity usage rather than a fixed grant amount. So essentially what the Department of Agriculture will do is look for your bills for the previous 12 months, and a solar survey will be done on your farm by the company who's installing the technology, and they'll look at the bills and determine from that how much electricity you've used in the previous 12 months. And from that, it'll be possible to deduce, that you're not oversizing the panels. And to be quite honest, it doesn't make sense to be oversizing the panels, because if you do oversize panels, you don't have the electricity, you don't have the export capacity for it, you're going to end up putting in export limiting systems at another cost, because you just won't be able to export electricity at certain times. So the solar survey, what they're looking for there is the previous 12 months electricity bills, the proposed PV panel output, the proposed battery output, the system mounting specifications. Only one house can be considered in the demand calculation. So sometimes you might have the parents' house, you might have a son or a daughter in proximity. It can only be one house that can avail of this, only one farmhouse that can avail of the grant. The survey will limit the size of the panels which you can install, and the TAMS 3 unit has to be an isolated and discrete system. So if you're doing something different for another business, or you have to have them as completely separate systems with separate inverters that's converting from direct current back to alternating current. You have to have them as separate systems. Any producer of renewable electricity has the right to export surplus electricity, and what they get is called the CEG, or the Clean Export Guarantee. And this was transposed into law by Minister Ryan back in 2018. And this is really a deal between the producer and the supplier of the electricity. So it's based on the market rate, current market rate. And the current market rate is between 14 to 24 cents per kilowatt hour or per unit of electricity. If I was speaking to you 2 years ago or before the invasion of Ukraine, certainly, the price was down at around 5 cents per kilowatt hour. But market prices of electricity are quite high at the moment. There is an expectation that this price will come back, hopefully to around 5 cents per kilowatt hour again, because we do want to see the market rate of electricity reducing, because we will be using a lot more electricity in the future in heating our homes, whether that's using a heat pump that requires a compressor, for example, or whether it's charging our electric cars in the future. We will need more electricity. So we do want to see these market rates coming back down. But at the moment, if you're selling electricity to the grid, there is a fairly decent price for that exported electricity. Note you are doing a deal with that company, or if you're buying it from SSE, or if you're buying it from Borgosh or Electric Ireland or Pinergy, whoever you're buying your electricity off, you'll be selling electricity back to them as well. So it'll be going both ways. So you do have to be careful that the price of the electricity that you're paying them at peak times, that you're still getting a good deal. And I think we will get smarter in terms of how we use our energy in the future as well, as we start using more solar. We'll be turning on washing machines and certain equipment on the farm at certain times of the day that will be coinciding with the peak electricity generation. Because if you're buying in electricity 35 cents per kilowatt hour, you can offset that by putting on equipment at a particular time of the day when you're generating that electricity, and coinciding with that, it makes a lot more sense. So you can also use, the planning has been removed, planning requirement has been removed for those roof-mounted systems. But there is, there are certain solar safeguard zones. There'd be areas close to airports or hospitals, where landing areas, where there may be potential glare issues. So there are limits there, but it's limits of up to 300 square meters. So I don't think it's that limiting around those solar safeguarding zones either. But there are limits for ground-mounted systems. So ground-mounted systems are eligible, but the area of the panels cannot exceed 75 square meters. But depending on, the watt hours or the kilowatt hours, the watts per panel, that will determine, how big you can get with those systems. But I've seen systems where you go up to 17 kilowatts of PV for ground-mounted systems. So it'll all depend on the technology provider. So the height of these freestanding arrays, that they shouldn't exceed 2.4 meters, or 2.5 meters in height either. So there's ground-mounted may be an option in certain situations. In terms of grid connection, you have to notify the ESB of your intention to install panels, and if you want to export back to the grid. So that means you have to apply to the new type of grid connection, and that's an NC7 form for mini generation, or an NC6 form for micro generation process. We did a good webinar on this a couple of weeks ago with ESB Networks. If any of you want to see the grid connection process and how that works, there's details on that. You can just, I'm sure if you Google the Teagasc connecting to the grid, you'll find that webinar with ESB Networks. So yeah, this is just the grid connection process. So you can see here for micro generation and mini generation is two types of terminologies. So up to 6 kilowatts for single phase, if you stay at microgeneration level. Like your domestic dwelling house will certainly be at microgeneration level, 6 kilowatts for single phase, and that's actually reducing to just over 5 kilowatts for single phase. That's going back through the inverter. So you could have a slightly larger system, but that's what's going back through the inverter. And again, it's up to 11 kilowatts for 3-phase electrical consumers. There's no
Barry,
connection.
we're getting a little tight on time. I do want to leave some time for questions, and
Yep.
I also do want to. I know you want to say a few words about the
Yeah.
EU project. So,
Yep.
If we could maybe 3 minutes, we could wrap
Yep.
things up.
Okay, I'll go through this, Mark. So from mini generation is up to 17 kilowatts for single phase. So this is, but you're applying to ESB networks to tell you how large you can get with your system. I say most dairy farmers will be put in a mini generation connection request, and up to 50 kilowatts of 3-phase. So yeah, so the agro-fossil free project, that's what I'm at here in Brussels at the moment. It's looking at a pathway towards fossil-free energy in Europe. And the project is trying to close the gap between novel fossil energy-free technology solutions and the development and the adoption of the use of available tools in everyday EU agricultural practices. Is trying to promote the effective exchange of novel ideas and information between research, industry, advisory, and the farming community. And it's teeing into key high-level European policy measures as well. This is about, I think we've developed around 20 policy recommendations at this stage. You can one thing I would say, Mark, as well, is that if people want to register on the agro-fossil free platform, you can register and see all these different technologies that are available and are being used right across Europe, from small scale hydro to solar systems, to small scale digesters. There's a whole list of different technologies that are on that register that people could get an idea as to what's being used to decarbonize or defossilize their energy use in farms across it. So that's the website that you can register on. Okay, so that just gives you an idea, and you can just browse there to see the different FEFs or solutions used. So final slide, so there's opportunities for the development of renewables on farms. Is great, there's roofs, there's land space. Dairy farms that operate spring calving systems to produce most of their milk in the summer, coinciding with the solar gain during the summer. Audits are something that people should be availing of to provide valuable information. Electricity prices have continuously fluctuated in recent years and will increase. Electricity prices in the coming years is likely. So Ireland will see an increased shift towards farm use and the supply of renewable energy. So I'll leave it at that, Mark, and we'll go to the questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Barry. We'll let you catch your breaths there for a moment. That was a real whirlwind tour through all of the options available to farmers. And look, there's a huge amount going on there. And obviously there's a huge commitment there from the government to support that transition to low carbon energy production across the country. And maybe it's just worth highlighting to people as well that there's an event coming up in July in Gurchin, Barry, the Energy and Farm Diversification event. That's a good opportunity for people to get to see some of the technologies and meet some of the different bodies that are involved in this space.
Yeah, that'll be a fairly big event. It's in the past, Mark, it was referred to as the Energy and Agriculture Show, but we've broadened it to Energy and Farm Diversification Show this year to look at opportunities for farmers to diversify into different areas such as food and agri-tourism and other rural development areas as well. So there'll be a big emphasis from the LEO and involvement in Tipperary LEO, supported by the Department of Agriculture and Food here, and also by AXA Insurance. So I think it'll be a fairly large event on the 20th of July in Gurchin College. So if anyone wants to see more information about it, just you can Google the Energy and Farm Diversification Show 2023.
Yeah, there is a website there for people to register. It's free to attend, I presume. It's just you do need to register. It's best advice to register.
Yeah, and there'll be a lot of exhibitors at it as well. You know, the providers of these different types of technologies, whether it's solar PV and all those different areas.
So just, I think, Google Energy. We'll put the link into the chat here. I've also included a link for the platform that you mentioned there to do with the agro-fossil free project, which looks like a really interesting project. Barry, you covered an awful lot there in a very short space of time, and people can look back at the presentation afterwards. There has been an issue, a lot of discussion around the use of prime agricultural land for solar farms. I see a couple of questions coming in there around whether farmers can claim single payment on this land. But just as a more general point, I mean, is there any concern there that we could be impacting on the food security? I know there was a scheme there last year to support farmers to sow more tillage land. Are there any concerns around that, or what's the position there in relation to erecting these panels on better land, we'll call it?
Yeah, I suppose the concern has been expressed, but not just for around panels, but also on the area of AD and the use of land for growing grass to supply anaerobic digesters. And the reality is that we're suboptimal in terms of our output of grass per hectare, especially in our beef areas. We have over 80,000 beef and sheep farmers who are on average using around growing around 6 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year, whereas the optimal will be up around 10 to 12 tons of dry matter per hectare per year. So I suppose in a lot of beef systems and sheep systems, the output wouldn't be as high as it could be if land was limed and if the right nutrient was going back onto the land. Certainly from a sustainability perspective, you wouldn't be putting on chemical nitrogen on land that would be producing grass for anaerobic digestion, because that would affect the sustainability figures. And there are strict sustainability criteria at European level as regards how much, what kind of reduction in greenhouse gases is required compared to the fossil fuel alternative in order for it to qualify and meet the requirements of the Renewable Energy Directive. So just to be aware of that, there is strict sustainability criteria. If this is to meet our targets going forward, it won't be accepted if we're not meeting that. In terms of solar panels as well, sheep can graze around it. It is possible to carry out that type of agricultural activity. Potentially, depending on how the panels are spaced out, you could cut grass between it, but sheep grazing would be the main activity that could be carried out. You can get your BPS or your BIS, as it's referred to these days, on that area, so long as no more than 70% of the area is covered by the panels. But the reality is that no more than 30% of the area will be covered by the panels. So what I'm finding in most situations is that if you had 10 hectares, for example, being covered by solar PV panels, you'd probably use maybe 30% of that, or 3 entitlements, and you would still have 70% of your land available, which means you'd still have 7 entitlements available.
Okay. That clarifies that, and thanks for that, Barry. I'm conscious we have a lot of questions coming in from our audience this morning. So, Kevin, I can see you're busy clustering some of those questions. We have about 10 minutes. So, Barry, if we could try and maybe be fairly succinct with the responses, we'll try and get through as many as possible, because we do have a huge level of interest in this topic this morning.
Very good. Thanks, Mark. Barry, there's a couple of questions just in connection to selling back to the grid. It wasn't allowed from solar grant aided systems under TAMS 2. Is it likely they will be allowed under TAMS 3?
Yeah, it is allowed. I suppose, as the department will say themselves, they can't stop you. The Department of Agriculture will say they can't stop you selling electricity back to the grid, but they don't want systems to be oversized, and systems should not be oversized, because you will be limited by your maximum export capacity, depending on your transformer capacity in your local rural area. 90% of rural areas are on what's called 15 kVA transformers, or kilovolt amp transformers, which means that you will have limited capacity to export electricity back to the grid in those areas, unless you go to the high cost of upgrading that transformer capacity, or putting in 3-phase supply yourself, which I don't think anyone is going to do. So it's the transformer capacity is the main limiting factor.
Okay. And there's a similar question about the floating feed-in premium. I suppose the same applies in that case.
Yep, the floating, well, we don't know enough about that, so I suppose we're in kind of in a grey area as regards speaking about the floating premium. That's going to be related to the new scheme that's due to be announced later, at the small scale generation electricity generation scheme, and that will be announced, I think, in the coming weeks, and we'll have an idea whether it's a capital grant, and these will be projects between 50 kilowatts and maybe up to 6 megawatts for community type projects. But I think we will see an opportunity here for farmers. Maybe they might have a small industry on their farm, or they may want to just export, put up maybe a wind turbine or a small area of solar PV, not cover hundreds of acres, maybe a couple of acres with solar PV panels, and export that electricity back to the grid. I think that there will be an opportunity in that as a diversification opportunity. And in order to get that surety of your feedback, of your payback, you will have that floating premium that will go above. That'll be a buffer there, that if the market price of electricity drops to a certain level, that feed-in premium will kick in to buffer that price.
Very good. And in connection with the single farm payment and claiming under the single farm payment, where does that stand with solar panels? Is a question coming up a few times.
Yeah, I just mentioned that there to Mark there a while ago. So you can claim your BIS or your BPS on land that has solar panels. So long as no more than 70% of the land is covered with the panels. But the reality is that I'm finding is that it's around the 30% mark, that up to 30% of the land will be covered by the panels, and that's the reduction or deduction that you're making on your BIS application. Is generally on 25 to 30%.
Question here, Barry, just from an advisor, saying that 80% plus of sheep and beef farmers are not eligible for this 60% solar TAMS grant, that solar companies are turning them down with the energy assessment. Does that make any sense
to
you?
They are eligible. I wouldn't say 80% of them are not eligible. It's their farmhouse. I suppose, look, at the reality is that a lot of them are not using a lot of electricity at this time of the year in their sheds, but they are allowed include, and a lot of sheds and farmhouses are on the same MPRN, the meter points reference number.
Yes.
So if they're on that makes it a lot simpler if they're on the same MPRN. If they're not on the same MPRN, they still can put in the farm yard and the farmhouse. And the figure the department is, if it's within 500 meters, if they're within 500 meters from one another, the farmhouse would have to be supplying some type of electricity on the field at the back of that farmhouse. It would maybe supplying an electric fence, but that is providing for the farm.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Very good.
Clarity there.
Something on a similar theme, Barry. For TAMS 3, can you apply for a battery storage larger than the 50% limit, but only receive the grant on the lower limit, if you like? That's
exactly right. So you can claim the 50%. So in that example that I put up there, it was a 10 kilowatt system. So all they can get is a 5 kilowatt hour battery system. So, but what I'm finding, Kevin, is that a lot of people are putting in larger systems, larger battery systems, because they feel they can get. So if they go above the 5 kilowatt hours in that situation, say put in an 8 kilowatt hour system, they'll be paying for 3 of that themselves without any grant aid.
Just a comment here. Could you comment on revenue from micro generation and the tax-free limit for agriculture? Is it comparable to domestic micro generation? And are there mechanisms to offset over a number of years?
Yeah. So if you invest in a renewable technology, like anything, it could be putting in a variable speed drive on your farm. It could be buying any energy efficient technology that's on the EEE register with SEAI. So if you just Google the SEAI EEE register, you see all those technologies that are there. You can write off the tax in the year of investment. So normally if we buy a tractor, if we buy some capital item, you're writing it off over a number of years at 12.5% per year. This can be written off in year 0, in the year of investment. So you're writing it off all in the 1 year. So if you have a cash rich year, that you will benefit in terms of a reduced tax bill by investing in these technologies.
Okay. And Barry, just a comment, more general comment that relates to the question I was going to ask you. I mean, this is quite a complex area for people who aren't familiar with it.
Sure.
And comments coming through here that, it is really interesting, quite complicated, and clearly there is a large changes coming down the tracks. Do Teagasc have plans to increase the number of energy specialists available to consult farmers, or who can farmers talk to get maybe an independent view on what their opportunities are there for around renewables?
Yeah, look, there's an ongoing consultation internally within Teagasc at the moment, a review of our, I suppose, our offer, our services, our advisory services at the moment. So there may be changes there in the near future, because I'm aware of that as well as you are, Mark, that we do need to, I suppose, provide that type of information to farmers, whether it's maybe doing energy audits or that advisors are in that space, that they can give that information at farm level to farmers about, their current energy use, and their potential ways of reducing their energy consumption. But there are individual auditors, or I suppose, around the country that do that, and that will carry out a farm audit for farmers as well. So there's independent people carrying out the service. But most of our advisors are agronomists, and they haven't been trained in this area specifically. We have done internal training. I've done it with our own advisors together with ATU and Sligo. We've done training courses for our advisors to upskill them in this area. But yes, when you're not doing it every day, and when it's not on your radar every day, it's an area that you can forget very, very quickly. So I think it's important to upskill people in this area, that we're able to provide this knowledge in the future.
Thanks.
Very good. Barry, this is a bit of an honours question for you here. I've heard a bit about fusion energy potentially being the big answer to our energy issues, for providing cheap energy. Is there any merit in this? If so, have we any idea how long it will take to be introduced here, and should we be taking this into consideration?
Yeah, I mean, look, at the whole area of nuclear has been discussed. I mean, we need to change in the constitution before we could see nuclear energy being, I suppose, part of our energy mix in the future. It may be. And there's merits for it in terms of reducing the carbon footprint of our electricity. France at the moment is over 70% of their electricity is coming from nuclear. So there is the potential that we could adopt it, but there would be a lot of resentment probably in local areas to get these kind of projects off the ground. I think there needs to be a burning platform before people will accept nuclear happening in their areas. There'll be other areas such as hydrogen, that will be probably a possibility, not necessarily in the short term or medium term, but maybe in the long term, whereby we're looking at H2O or hydrogen, producing hydrogen from water through electrolysis. And there may be on-farm opportunities there as well in the future. But some of these technologies are more medium to long term than short term.
Yeah, and nuclear fusion is very much a technology of the future, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And most of the technology we spoke about today are more relevant to maybe the short term and what's happening now. But yeah, that's certainly areas that we could be looking at in the future. And it'll all change. There's no doubt about it. The way we produce and use energy is going to change dramatically in this country and right across the world. We will be moving away from fossil technologies, but there will be hiccups along the way in that transition to renewables. But we're going to, and there will be, I suppose, mistakes made along the way as well. But as I say, it's the jigsaw puzzle of technologies, and it's bringing them all together is going to be the challenge.
We're just coming up at 10:30 here, Barry. One final question here about the solar capital investment scheme there. What determines farmer eligibility for that scheme?
You need a hard number. Every farmer is eligible for it. You need to carry out the solar survey. So I think any farmer who's interested in it needs to be, I suppose, engaging a technology provider fairly soon to get into the first tranche of the solar capital investment scheme. And don't worry if you don't make the first tranche by the 30th of June. There will be another tranche, and this scheme will be running for the next 5 years. It's a separate pot of money than other capital investment measures under TAMS. So there will be another tranche. But I suppose the earlier you do get in, you get to get your installation in your system up and running, and you're generating electricity for your farm, and you're able to sell any excess electricity as well. So there is a bit of a lead in time between getting your grid connection agreement with ESB networks. So there is a bit of paperwork required. The main thing will be to dig out your ESB bills for the previous 12 months, because that's the first question that any technology provider will be asking you. Shows your bills for the previous 12 months for both your farm and your farmhouse.
Barry, thank you so much for your time today. And I know you've had to step out of that meeting in Brussels, but we know it really is an important topic for everybody. And Maybe to also make people aware that I know the Department of Agriculture have done some webinars and communications around the schemes as well, for people to go onto the Department of Agriculture website if they want further information. But I think there's definitely, we might be getting you back again, Barry, based on the number of questions that have come through this morning.
No problem.
Kevin, thanks so much for helping with questions. And a reminder, yes, that event, the Energy and Farm Diversification Show, takes place on the 20th of July in Gurteen College, County Tipperary. So you can find out information just on the website. Next week, we'll be joined by Dr. George Ramsbottom, who is the newly appointed head of the Signpost Advisory Programme. And George is going to be talking about the plans within that new programme, free service to farmers, supporting them to transition to low carbon production systems. So until next week, enjoy the fine weather while it lasts, and we will talk to you next Friday at 9:30. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.